are false or unreliable, thereby undermining their sense of self-trust, their cognitive abilities, and mental sanity. And in many cases, the examples provided in this literature are cases in which the gaslighter has a related practical goal, such as destroying the mere possibility of disagreement between him and the victim in order to gain control over them. But in cases of medical gaslighting, my thought was that maybe something different was at play here. Now, I'm not trying to say that medical professionals never rely or use manipulative tactics of this sort for their own personal gain. I'm sure there are plenty of bad doctors, but given how widespread the phenomenon seems to be in the medical context, and because I think we can assume that medical professionals, at least in most cases, honestly try to help and find solutions for the patients, I wanted to investigate whether part of what is happening in these cases is epistemically innocent in the sense described by Lisa Bortolotti, and in the sense that if it is obviously harmful towards the patients, maybe some of the cognitive processes involved in medical gaslighting may also confer epistemic benefits that would not be otherwise available to the medical professionals in question. And I think if this is the case, if it happens to be epistemically innocent, this could contribute to explaining why such a harmful practice continues to be so present in the medical context. So my aim for this talk is to answer the question of whether medical gaslighting can be epistemically innocent, and if so, how. So my plan for this talk is, since gaslighting is a rather recent term and everyone might not be familiar with it, I'll begin by briefly presenting what typical gaslighting is, what it looks like, and illustrate it with some classical examples. I will then move on to define medical gaslighting more specifically. And finally, I will try and argue that at least some occurrences of medical gaslighting are likely to be epistemically innocent, in the sense that, that some of the cognitive processes involved in the gaslighting confers epistemic benefits to the medical professionals that would not be otherwise available to them at that time. So let's begin with a brief introduction of gaslighting. The term gaslighting roughly refers to a form of manipulation in which the gaslighter tries, consciously or not, to induce someone the sense that her reactions, perceptions, memories, and or beliefs are not just mistaken, but utterly without grounds, and often so unfounded as to qualify as crazy. It appears that the term gaslighting was a largely obscure and esoteric term until pretty recently, supposedly until maybe 10 years ago, when it began to be part of mainstream culture. And I think whereas it used to be reserved for pretty extreme cases of manipulation that would lead to justify the victim's commitment into a psychiatric institution, for example, the term seems to now be applied very much more broadly to designate the manipulative tactic of making someone question their own reality. But to understand the meaning and origins of the term, we need to turn to one of the most common examples used to illustrate interpersonal gaslighting. And that is the 1944 movie Gaslight, and the play on which it was based, in which a husband named Gregory, and played by Charles Boyer, tricks his wife Paula, Ingrid Bergman, into believing that she is mentally unwell in order to steal from her. So here's a description of the story. Unbeknownst to her, Paula is in possession of precious jewels that belong to her aunt, who used to be a famous opera singer, who's been mysteriously murdered when Paula was a young girl. And Gregory, her husband, in fact murdered Paula's aunt and is now set on gaining possession of the jewels. That is why he marries Paula before convincing her to return to live in London in her aunt's old house. So Gregory believes that the lost jewels are in the attic and often pretends to go out on business when what he is actually doing is climbing up into the attic to look for the lost jewels. And the term gaslighting comes from the fact that he actually uses the gaslight in the attic, which has the effect of dimming the lights in the rest of the house. And as a result, Paula sees this. She sees the dimming of the lights and often hears mysterious footsteps in the attic. But instead of admitting what he is up to, Gregory repeatedly assures Paula that she is imagining things, that the lights are not dimming, that there is no noise in the attic, although he is the cause of both of these things, and suggests instead that she is overtired and questions her memory and perceptions of the events instead. He also goes to arrange things around the house so that it appears that she has been stealing, hiding, or moving objects in the house. And when Paula cannot recollect doing any of these things, because she hasn't, Gregory uses her reaction to confirm his fake suspicion that she is mentally unstable. And what happens is, as a result of this, and because Paula trusts her husband, her confidence in her own judgment and mental faculties gradually deteriorate. And this is all part of Gregory's plan to drive Paula to the point where she believes she is mad, so that he can get her out of his way and search for the lost jewels more efficiently. So this is kind of the original case, and it also explains the origin of the term gaslighting. Another often cited example of gaslighting in the philosophical literature is borrowed from another movie called Pat and Mike. And in this movie, Pat is an aspiring female golfer, but her fiancé, Collier, wants her to give up her golf career so that they can get married and that she can assume her wifely duties instead. He uses the excuse of a tournament in which Pat doesn't do very well and takes the advantage of this opportunity to press her to give up her career, something that Pat clearly does not want to do, and to marry him instead. And during their conversation, Collier refuses to express support for Pat, tacitly but persistently suggests doubts in her ability to make judgments for herself, and issues the subtle threats that her failure to see things his way might result in the end of the relationship. So whereas Gregory's gaslighting of Paula is about gaining control over her by means of providing her with significant but false epistemic reasons or evidence against trust in her own cognitive faculties, Collier's gaslighting of Pat attempts relying on her emotional commitment to him, but with the clear goal of ensuring that she will comply with his vision of their future together. So with very few but exceptions, very little has been done in philosophy to explain the exact nature of gaslighting and its epistemic and ethical dimensions. But I think there are two main accounts for describing this. And what I labeled the emotional manipulation account and the epistemic manipulation account of gaslighting. And although the two accounts broadly describe gaslighting in similar terms, they disagree on what is most central or essential to it, as well as on what counts as a most paradigmatic example of gaslighting. So the first account, the emotional manipulation account, is defended by Kate Abramson, and she sees gaslighting as a form of emotional manipulation in which the gaslighter is not trying to convince, but rather demands of the victim that she sees things his way. So on her view, gaslighting does not involve a discussion about evidence or epistemic reasons, but relies on manipulative threats for the victim to comply. And of course, this account takes the case of Pat and Mike as a paradigmatic case of gaslighting. On the other hand, we have what I call the epistemic manipulation view that's defended by Andrew Spear. And he argues that one cannot understand gaslighting properly without engaging with its epistemic dimensions. On his view, even if the gaslighter's motivation could be the desire to gain control over them, the gaslighter's tactic typically involves giving the victim epistemic reasons to convince them that they are cognitively unreliable. So in other words, where Abramson's view sees gaslighting as essentially leveraging affective and prudential aspect of the victim's situation, Spear sees gaslighting as essentially exploiting the victim's epistemic trust in the gaslighter to undermine their sense of self-trust by manufacturing reasons and evidence for them to doubt themselves. And if I understand their accounts correctly, I think one consequence of their disagreement is that it might have effects on how we understand the rationality or the epistemic rationality of the victim's attitudes and her reasons for undermining her self-trust. So on Abramson's view, the victim stops seeing herself as an independent locus of thought because of prudential and effective considerations, mostly to maintain her relationship with the gaslighter. Whereas on Spear's view, the victim's attitude can be epistemically rational, assuming that it can ever be rational to one's experience of the world to that degree, insofar as their attitude is motivated by epistemic reasons. Okay, I think it's important to note that many examples of gaslighting involve and rely on prejudice. And this is because, as the sociology of gaslighting and Abramson actually discuss, power inequities are enablers for gaslighting. So this is also why we paradigmatically use he to talk about the gaslighter and her to talk about the victim, although it's of course not always that way. And I think it's also another point that's important to keep in mind about gaslighting is that gaslighting cannot truly be understood as an isolated event. So both authors really insist on this, although the examples that are provided often constitute snippets of a person's life. It's because marginalized groups are confronted with this kind of discourse over and over, or over a long period of time, that the effects of gaslighting are so important. Okay, so keeping this in mind, let's turn to medical gaslighting. So more recently, the concept of gaslighting has been applied to different kinds of situations and contexts, not just interpersonal or romantic or intimate relationships, such as the examples provided above, but also political. It's been used to describe Trump's attitudes toward his citizens, but also cultural and medical. So what is medical gaslighting and how is it different from the examples provided above? Applying our general understanding of gaslighting to the medical context, we understand medical gaslighting to occur whenever medical professionals, and for purposes of simplicity here, I'll just refer to the medical professional as the doctor and to the victim of gaslighting as the patient, but it could be other kinds of medical professionals, of course. But it describes how the medical professionals react towards patients in a way that suggests that not only the patient's testimony is false, but that they are also not in a position to offer reliable evidence on the matter at hand. And this can look like any of the following examples. So typically minimizing or normalizing symptoms and feelings. So for example, telling a patient their pain is normal or ordinary, or that they cannot possibly be in the pain they purport to be, telling them it's in their head. So telling the patient the symptoms and feelings are a figment of their imagination, that they are the signs of mental distress, and that consequently the physical symptoms need not be addressed. Refusing to run tests on the basis of the claim that the doctor already knows what the patient's problem is, or that there's nothing wrong with them. Telling the patient there's nothing wrong with them. So telling this on the basis of their medical tests and records, in spite of the way the patient is feeling. And finally, attributing physical symptoms to stress and anxiety without a specific reason to do so. So although it may sometimes be true that the cause of a patient's symptoms is stress or anxiety or a mental condition, there's a tendency for doctors who cannot find a physical source for the patient's symptoms to be dismissive of the fact that physical symptoms could be treated, and assume that if they cannot find a source for their symptoms, then stress or anxiety is a more likely explanation than any other alternative. So these fragments of interactions are the kind of reactions that are reported by patients in their descriptions of medical gaslighting. And I think it's easy to see how repeated instances of this kind can amount to a form of gaslighting in which patients feel like their testimony about their own bodily feelings and their ability to trust their own experience of themselves is being undermined. And just like in typical cases of gaslighting, medical gaslighting reflects broader power dynamics and inequities in medicine and healthcare, making marginalized groups particularly vulnerable to medical gaslighting. So, and in particular, as Jennifer Sebring explains, as a spokesperson for the institution of medicine, the doctor has the power to pronounce what is real and what is not. Operating from this hierarchical understanding of knowledge, in that science is the final word, the doctor can make this pronouncement, and the patient is given little room, if any, to rebuff their claim, which puts the doctor in a position of authority and power over the patient. This being said, while I do not want to deny that certain doctors gaslight their patients with the aim of gaining some practical advantage, as in the typical cases of gaslighting that we discussed earlier, I also believe that many cases of medical gaslighting are not of this sort. So I will here assume that most doctors do have the clear and explicit aim of helping their patients, of making accurate diagnosis and finding solution for their patients' problems, and no real purpose in undermining their sense of general self-trust to gain control over them in the way Gregory has a reason to gaslight Paula, for example. And I will assume that at least some, if not many, instances of gaslighting are the result of a different set of motivations and interests than the ones that are usually central to typical gaslighting. One of which could be the epistemic benefits it confers to the doctors. Okay, so in this last section of the talk, I'd like to address the question of whether medical gaslighting is or is likely to be epistemically innocent. And my hypothesis is that one of the reasons why medical gaslighting is likely to qualify as epistemically innocent is partly dependent on the principles of evidence-based medicine. So as you may well know, the concept of epistemic innocence is put forward by Lisa Bortolotti to explain the persistence and pervasiveness of certain epistemically defective cognitive processes. So she, building on the legal notion of innocence, she argues that under the right circumstances, an otherwise culpable action may be deemed innocent if it has broader benefits that would not be achievable otherwise. And in her view, the same kind of considerations can be applied in the epistemic realm. And if an epistemically defective cognitive process confers an epistemic benefit that would not otherwise be available, then the processor attitude is epistemically innocent. So typical examples of epistemically innocent cognitive processes include things like confabulation and motivated delusions. And if these processes make a person more likely to form future true beliefs or helps them maintain a coherent self-concept that will in turn allow the person to achieve further epistemic goals, then the defective process has epistemic benefits, in spite of being defective. But to account for the epistemic innocence of gaslighting, it is important that we determine what exactly are the attitudes or the process that we are targeting. Because I think it could be very natural to understand gaslighting as a broad activity, right? Something that gaslighters mostly do rather than something that they believe. Something that is constituted of various attitudes, assertions, and cognitive processes that are distributed over time. But to apply the notion of epistemic innocence here, it is important that we pick one attitude or cognitive process to evaluate for epistemic innocence. In his latest paper on gaslighting, Speer actually addresses the epistemic innocence of gaslighting, but he does so by focusing on confabulation and the kind of confabulation that is likely to be involved in both sides of the process of gaslighting. But it's unclear to me that this is the process that we ought to target in cases of medical gaslighting. In my opinion, many of the instances of medical gaslighting that are likely to arise from from the doctor's disbelief of the patient's testimony, or the belief that their reported feelings and symptoms are unreal or exaggerated. And I think the examples that we provided above kind of supports this understanding. And I think it is this disbelief that that we ought to target. Given how pervasive this attitude seems to be in the medical context, I think it's interesting to ask ourselves whether this disbelief is epistemically defective, and if so, whether it might be epistemically innocent in the sense that it confers epistemic benefits that would not be otherwise available to the doctor. So the first step in establishing whether an attitude or cognitive process is epistemically innocent depends on whether the attitude or process is epistemically defective. So this is not really a condition, but it's necessary to apply the concept of epistemic innocence. So confabulation and motivated delusions, for example, fit this description insofar as they are often false and ill-grounded. And in cases of medical gaslighting, I think the doctor's disbelief of the patient's testimony are also often false. I think one of the disastrous consequences of medical gaslighting, besides the emotional cost for the victims, are the fact that by not taking them seriously, the doctor then often fails to engage with what is really causing them to have the symptoms and find appropriate treatments early on. And I also think that disbelieving the patient's testimony and forming the belief that the reported symptoms are unreal or exaggerated also seems ill-grounded. even though doctors may be in a position of epistemic authority in regards to medical issues or determining a medical diagnosis, it is also the case that patients have a privileged epistemic access to their own bodily feelings and experiences. So dismissing the patient's experience as a reliable source of evidence is likely to count as a form of insensitivity to evidence on the behalf of the doctor, and hence undermine the epistemic rationality of their attitude. So if this is true, and assuming that the doctor's belief is indeed epistemically defective in at least one of these two ways, there are two conditions for determining whether a belief or process is epistemically innocent. The first is the epistemic benefit condition. A belief or process is epistemically innocent only if it increases the chances of the agent obtaining epistemic goods like true belief and knowledge. And although these epistemic benefits are often mediated by psychological ones, it is important to underline that this isn't simply a condition about psychological benefits, but ultimately about epistemic ones. So if we take the case of motivated delusions, for instance, the psychological benefits of avoiding a breakdown is beneficial not only psychologically, but also insofar as it allows the person to continue to function well epistemically, what Bortolotti calls epistemic functionality. And in the case of medical gaslighting, my hypothesis is that in many cases, disbelieving patients' testimony is likely to lead to two types of epistemic benefits for the doctor. The first epistemic benefit conferred by the disbelief that P is mediated by the gain of time that is likely to confer in cases where the patient's testimony does not support any clear diagnosis. So, assuming doctors often disbelieve patients' testimony when the information they provide sounds unlikely to lead anywhere, by not engaging with this evidence, the doctor can move on to other sources of evidence, such as medical tests or other patients, where the doctors are more likely to form true beliefs and knowledge because they have a clearer sense of what's going on. And the second type of epistemic benefit that I think might be gained by this disbelief is mediated by the psychological well-being of the doctor. So once again, in situations where the patient's testimony does not seem to clearly support any clear-cut diagnosis, would the doctor engage with this evidence, they would find themselves in the uncomfortable position of not knowing what their patient is suffering from or how to help. And this discomfort and feeling of incompetence threatens the coherence and stability of their belief system in a way that is likely to threaten their epistemic functionality and their confidence in making further medical diagnosis. So in certain scenarios, disbelieving the patient's testimony might therefore contribute to retaining a sense of moral worth and well-being and competence that will in turn allow them to achieve their other epistemic goals, such as remaining confident in diagnosing other patients. I think it's important here to say that this kind of disbelief doesn't come with no epistemic cost. As Bortolotti insists, the notion of epistemic innocence does by no means dismiss the importance of the epistemic cost of these epistemically defective states, but only shows that they also confer epistemic benefits in spite of being false or ill-grounded. Okay. However, to count as epistemically innocent, these benefits need to not be available otherwise. So the second condition for epistemic innocence is what is called the no alternatives condition. And according to this condition, the epistemic benefits described above could not have been attainable otherwise. And as described by Sullivan Bussett, there are three types of unavailability. There is strict unavailability, motivational unavailability, and explanatory unavailability. So an alternative attitude is strictly unavailable if it is based on information that is opaque to introspection or otherwise irretrievable. This is typically the case of confabulation, for example, where the reasons for acting are simply not retrievable or mentally accessible to the agent. An attitude is motivationally unavailable if it is inhibited or not accessed due to motivational factors. And this is typically the kind of unavailability at play in cases of self-deception, where the doxastic alternative to the self-deceptive belief may be perceptually available, yet motivationally unavailable due to a strong desire that P be not the case. And finally, an alternative attitude is explanatorily unavailable if it is strictly speaking unavailable for consideration by the subject, but is not regarded as a genuine contender. It is dismissed due to its apparent implausibility. And Sylvan Bissett gives a kind of funny example here that is a little bit far-fetched, but she says, suppose there are bite marks in my cheese, I hear scratching at night and my cat is agitated. I come to the conclusion that I have mice in my house. Very likely explanation. An alternative explanation might be that a cheese-eating, cat-irritating, noisy fairy is infiltrating my home at night. This alternative is either not considered by me, or it is such that I ruled it out on grounds of implausibility or poor explanatory power relative to the preferred and adopted cognition. And when it comes to medical gaslighting, my hypothesis is that medical training and evidence-based medicine may be participating in making the patient's testimony about their symptoms explanatorily unavailable, in the sense that the truth of their statements are immediately dismissed due to their apparent implausibility in the light of existing evidence. So if this is true, then it is the context and culture of these medical interactions that contribute to making the belief that P unavailable to the gaslighter here. To give a little more information about the context, I think it's important to note that evidence-based medicine is often defined as the use of the current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients, and explicitly provides guidelines for what counts as good evidence in making diagnosis. So more specifically, it provides doctors with a clear hierarchy of evidence in which some sources of evidence are supposed to weigh more than others, rendering some alternatives less available than others and implausible in the light of the doctor's evidence. Interestingly, I think this hierarchy of evidence contains a list of different types of scientific journals, articles, and studies with randomized controlled trials at the very top. But nowhere in this hierarchy is the patient's testimony mentioned as a source of evidence. And while I do not think that this means that doctors do not see their patient's testimony as evidence at all, I do think that randomized controlled trials and other studies are seen as the best source of evidence in making diagnosis, which is very likely to affect the respective weight that is given to patients' testimony, especially in cases in which their testimony does not directly reflect the evidence present in the scientific literature. So if this is true, and I'm right in thinking that many instances of medical gaslighting fit with the conditions just described, then at least some instances of medical gaslighting are epistemically innocent. And again, this does not mean that the harms generated by medical gaslighting aren't real or significant, only that they also confer epistemic benefits that would not be available otherwise. And what I personally find interesting in the case of medical gaslighting is that part of this unavailability for alternative attitudes could be explained by reference to the medical framework in which these interactions occur. So I will conclude because I'm clearly over time. I think there's still a lot to develop in relation to this, but I do hope that I've shown that one of the reasons why epistemic gaslighting might be so pervasive is because it allows doctors to obtain epistemic benefits that would not otherwise be attainable because of the context in which they operate. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Great talk. The floor is now open for discussion. Cameron, and then James.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me properly?
Can you speak up?
Hey, can you hear me properly? Seems like you have to press the button.
No, it's fine. I think the green light is on.
Oh.
Do you want to come stand here? No, it should
The
work.
green light doesn't seem to be.
Just listen.
I can hear you. I don't know if Melanie does.
I hear noises, but I can't understand what somebody's
Can you
saying.
hear a human voice now?
I can hear you, but not very clearly.
Switch off the speaker. No.
Okay, how about now?
It's not too
How about
bad.
now? Oh, can I go up to that?
Yeah. Okay, let's just unplug this and use your voice. But can you speak up a little bit, Cameron?
Okay, so can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better. Thank
Okay,
you. Sorry.
awesome. Okay, so thanks for the talk. I thought that was really super interesting stuff. And the thing that I'm just trying to get clearer on is, so when you're saying that medical gaslighting can be epistemically innocent, I'm just trying to get a better sense of why like medical gaslighting per se can be epistemically innocent, as opposed to say, for example, just like doctors not giving credence, enough credence to patient testimony. Like, is that sufficient for counting as gaslighting them? Like, why does the gaslighting part need to be done in order to gain the requisite epistemic benefits?
So your question is like, I'll just repeat to make sure we're on the same page. Is the doctor's attitude simply dismissing and disbelieving rather as opposed to medical gaslighting? Is that your question?
Yeah, like is just the not giving due credence part, like is that not sufficient for sort of reaping the epistemic benefits? Or like do we actually need to do the further like manipulation component?
Okay, thank you. That's a really good question. So I think it's hard to talk about gaslighting and medical gaslighting as well without seeing the full picture here, because I think to understand the phenomenon, you can't like focus on just one specific instance, but like the effects that it has over time. So maybe there are epistemic benefits as well, just in the doctor dismissing a patient's testimony once, but I think if we're to, and this is something I didn't have time to discuss so much in the talk, but I think when we are going to compare the harms that ensue from this kind of practice with the benefits that it allows to gain, I think the gaslighting dimension and the systematic dimension will come to light. Because it's not the epistemic benefits are not only just gained from a single interaction, but they're gained from like having this kind of attitudes over a long period of time.